Go. My name is Randy, and I'm going to be speaking about helping your players feel smart puzzles as user interface. One quick correction to what it says in the program. I'm no longer working at Electronic Arts. I work at my own studio that I started, tiny little studio called Tiger Style. Won't be talking about any of that right now. We're hiring 2D artists. Okay. I'm going to have kind of a longer intro where I contextualize the problem we're going to solve and clarify what I am and am not going to be talking about. If at any point during the intro you realize I'm not going to be giving you the thing that you are hoping to get here, you're absolutely welcome to take off and go to the experimental gameplay workshop. I'm kind of shocked that you're here at all, but thank you very much for being here, or any of the other things that I'm competing with that also sounded really good. So what am I going to be talking about? I'm going to be talking about designing puzzles for video games and drawing from the field of user interface design to try to bring those principles to designing puzzles. Specifically, it's talking about bulletproofing an existing idea for a puzzle, making it, making the design better up front and tuning it in response to playtest. We'll not be talking about coming up with a cool creative idea for a puzzle in the first place. This kind of assumes you already have one. Ooh, that's a whole other separate discussion. I'm not talking about these types of puzzles, like traditional puzzle game puzzles in the puzzle game genre. And it's more like these types of puzzles. This is Tomb Raider Anniversary. It's a remake of one of the very early classic Tomb Raider puzzles. So what I mean is I'm talking about puzzles that are embedded in some other game, like an action game or something like that. Adventure game, something like that. So this is this is a great example of a puzzle. So, in this puzzle, there's a lever that Lara can pull, and that'll spin a gear on the far left over there. And what you're trying to do is get it to spin the gear on the far right as well, because when you spin the gear on the far right, that opens the door. And so you have to go collect all these gears and plug them onto these posts so that these two gears are then connected, and then when you pull the lever, the door opens. This is the kind of puzzle I'm talking about. Oh, look, there you got the gears. I'm not talking about graphic design. That's sometimes what people mean when they say user interface design. I'm more talking about the interactive functionality of the puzzles, not their appearance, although they're not completely unconnected. And with respect to puzzles in video games, there's actually two layers of user interface. The first layer is the player to avatar layer. It's like you're holding a controller and you want this avatar in the world to do something for you. So, pushing A is how you get Lara to pull the button. And then there's a second layer, which is kind of the avatar in the world trying to figure out how to get that game world to work for them. So pulling the lever opens the door would be part of the second layer. We're talking about the second layer only. So if you're having problems where your players know they need Lara to pull the lever, they have no idea which button to push, that's not covered. But what we are covering is that, the problem might be something like, yeah, I know I'm supposed to pull this lever, but what does it do? I don't know what happened. That's the type of problem we'll be solving. Here are some games I either worked on or contributed to in some small capacity or was around when they were made. So these are immersive sim games is what we call them. So again, it's this idea that you're an avatar. You play a character who's embedded in a world that's supposed to seem real. Here's an example of a puzzle that we had in Thief Deadly Shadows. There's this library and it's full of books. And Thief Deadly Shadows took place in this somewhat open world where you could go anywhere or whatever. And, what you're supposed to do in this puzzle is search this library full of books for clues. And sometimes these clues would point you to locations in the map. You'd hear about these secret lost locations and so forth. And so you went to the right spot in the map that was an entrance to this new mission that you could find. So you'd go read some other book and hear some other hint. And then when you went to that spot in the map, there'd be some other mission that would open up, right? So you were Garrett, the character in our game, the avatar, and you're doing this research. You're learning about these lost places, and that's pretty cool. And that's, puzzles are great. This is one of the things they do really well. They can help your players feel really smart. They kind of switch up the pace and the aesthetic of the game, provide a slightly different experience for a while. They get your player involved with the story. They're not just being fed the story. They're kind of helping push it along. They're really kind of tangibly connected to the story. And they're also good for motivating exploration. Hey, search this whole library. Look in every dark and dusty corner, and you'll find all kinds of stuff, including these clues that you're looking for. And I really like puzzles. I wish there were more puzzles in games, One of the things I like about Indiana Jones isn't just that he goes around whipping Nazis all the time, although that's great. It's that he can also read the hieroglyphics on the wall and interpret things about, archaeological history, right? And that part's really cool. He's a multifaceted character. And it's cool to play a Garrett who not only sneaks around in the shadows and blackjack guys, but can also sort of do research and discover lost things that no one else has found before. Puzzles have this really bad problem, though, which is that they have this nasty tendency to do the opposite of the things that we're trying to get them to do. Instead of making players feel smart, they make players feel dumb. Instead of making the pace nicely varied, they slam the pace to a halt. Players get stuck. They're not moving forward anymore. Big problem. So I've heard it said, and in fact I've heard myself say it in the past, that the way to solve this problem is to treat all players like they're really dumb. like that this is the best puzzle they could ever possibly solve. I no longer hold this point of view. So what's wrong with puzzles? Why are they hard? Why do players get stuck on them? Okay, well, in Tomb Raider, there's a lot of things that you can do as Lara by the time you come across this first puzzle. You can climb, you can do somersaults, you can shoot at wolves, Tomb Raider things. And if you come into a new space, like even if the space is like a totally different design you've never seen before, you can apply those tools to that. You're like trained in climbing around on things and shooting wolves. But you have like no background in pulling levers to make gears turn to open doors. It's like this new thing that you've never encountered before. You have to get trained from the ground up. Later on, you'll have done this a lot, but at the beginning, not so much. And likewise in Thief, you've got a lot of training in sneaking around and blackjacking guards, and if you come into a new situation, you can do that reasonably well. But there's no precedent for reading books to open missions. It's this brand new thing we're introducing. So one of the problems with puzzles is that they're novel situations. It's also a strength of puzzles. Again, we're trying to increase, the variety of aesthetic and pace, but it's a challenge. Another really big challenge for puzzles and immersive games is these worlds are supposed to look and feel real, and they're full of set dressing and texture and so forth, whose job is to provide reality but not actually be part of the puzzle. But it's easy that players misinterpret these little bits and pieces as part of the puzzle. They get stuck. They're not on the right track, and they're like, I wonder if this thing has something to do with it. But we as designers know, no, that's just a piece of set dressing. So it's full of these red herrings that they can get hung up on. And games are really, really low fidelity experience. It doesn't matter how many polygons and shaders we have. They are nothing like real life. Okay, you don't have a sense of smell, hopefully. You can't feel things, you can't taste things, hopefully. So if you come across something like a gear and you're supposed to understand this is a gear, you don't have a lot to go on. Is that a shield? Is that a dinner plate? How heavy is it? Is it elastic? Is it slimy? These are things that would be apparent in real life that, in a video game you don't have. So I've often said that, playing a game compared to real life is being in real life and looking through everything through a toilet paper tube while wearing, oven mitts, it's really hard to manipulate objects. So you can pick the thing up and you got to drop it on a certain spot, and you just really don't feel as agile as you would in real life. So it's there's the gear. What the fuck is, Jesus. This is a video game. They are not high fidelity. I'm sorry. So given all that stuff, it's kind of understandable that this is the puzzle, and it's step one, step two, and then you're at the goal, and this is what the player's supposed to solve. That players can get confused. They might get off the right track and just not know what they're supposed to be doing. They might kind of have it figured out, but they've got one of the steps wrong. They might know what they're supposed to be doing, but they're not not doing it the right way, or they might just have the whole thing wrong. It's easy for even intelligent and observant players to miss things or misinterpret things. And so this can be kind of a challenging puzzle when it's inside of a video game. It's not that players are dumb, it's that we don't give them a whole lot to work with. They got to kind of improvise their way through these handicaps. So it leads to this question, how do you solve this problem? How much guidance do you give players? You're sending them off into this puzzle, and you kind of give them a backpack full of information. And if you give them tons of information, they're going to feel dumb because you gave them too much, you spelled it all out. But if you don't give them enough information, there's a risk they're going to get stuck, and then they're going to feel dumb because they're stuck. And so is there some sweet spot in the middle, where you've given them just the right amount of information, where the puzzle seemed hard, but they did it anyway, and so that makes them feel smart? And I think this is really important. I'm going to come back around to this at the very end. So that last slide is about the problem we're trying to solve, and this is about how well we have to solve it. So what I'm imagining here is this is a video game, and as you go through the game, there's only these 5 puzzles. There's only 5 puzzles in the whole game. And the question is how well do you have to solve them? So let's say these are the percentage success rate for these puzzles. And so by success, I mean the player is able to get through it themselves. And failure means they didn't get through it themselves. That means they got stuck, they had to ask for help, they went on the internet, they gave up the game, they quit your game, So that's what failure means. These look like good grades. If you went to college, you'd be pretty excited about these grades. But, if you think about 1 million players playing your game, how many players are getting stuck on each of these puzzles? And here's what the math is. It turns out to be there's 180,000 instances of people getting stuck. And when I describe the failure of that puzzle, that's kind of significant. 180,000 cases where people want to quit your game. That's almost 20%. That's fucking bad, actually. And so if you do the math backwards and you start with an acceptable attrition rate, because you're never going to get it perfect, right? So maybe you think 10,000 cases is a bit more acceptable, and you do that math backwards, it turns out the percentage, your grade has to be way over 99%. And this is why I use the word bulletproofing. Puzzles have to be really solid. Players really have to get through them. We really have to solve this problem well, or else, they don't work and people quit your game. And this is one of the reasons I think people don't put puzzles in their game, and we don't get some of the nice benefits they provide. So I went to work for a studio called Arcane Studios a few years ago, and they're working on a game called Dark Messiah: Might and Magic, and I was contracting to help out with the level design. And, they had these levels built and they're in playtest, and we had some really cool and really ambitious puzzles, and we were watching the problems the puzzles had and the solutions we kind of were instinctively in this ad hoc manner applying to the problems we saw. And it started to occur to me that the solutions we were ascribing sounded a lot like user interface design, and that was kind of exciting to me because user interface design is a more formal and a better established field than game design, and it works pretty good. And so it seemed cool that we could pull some of those principles across. So that's kind of where this presentation came from. The specific type of user interface design I want to talk about is user-centered design. Who's read this book, The Design of Everyday Things by Donald Norman? Okay, it's a good showing. If you haven't and you like this topic, it's a great book to read. But basically, it's about helping a user figure out how to use an object they've never seen before. And the principle is that the object should provide its own instruction. It doesn't need a manual. It just teaches you how to use it itself. It suggests the ways it can be used. It helps you stay on the right track when you're trying to get something done with it. So classic examples of user-centered design is like a handle on a door. This handle both tells you where to operate the door and what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to pull the door right here. That's how you operate this door. A tea kettle that whistles when the tea is boiling it tells you that the tea is ready. It's good user-centered design. Tent poles that have different sizes and shapes, but there's only one correct way they should be assembled. If they only fit together, because of the size and shape of the openings when they slide together, they can only be assembled in one way. That's great user-centered design. You can't accidentally construct the wrong tent. It also applies to situations, not just objects. Like if you're at the airport and you find your gate really quickly, that's good user-centered design. So that's the type of UI design we're going to be talking about because it applies to practical objects in the real world, and that's a lot like puzzle design. There's two parts of this presentation, wrapping up the intro now. Part one, there's going to be 6 principles of user-centered design I talk about, and then there's this thing called puzzle structures that I'm going to talk about. These are both adapted from Norman's book, but I did kind of a fair amount of adaptation in some cases because in some cases his stuff didn't apply all that well and needed some rework. So here we go. The first principle we're going to talk about is visibility. And in short, visibility just means, does the player know this thing exists? Like the elements of the puzzle, do they know they exist? And if they do they know what state they're in? So classic example from user-centered design, the thing on the left is good because you can see the handles, you can see the cupboards, you can see the boundaries between them. You know where the parts are. You know how to operate this thing. You're heading in the right direction because you can see the parts. Whereas the one on the right is kind of like one of those fancy ones where you push it in and then it pops back out, and that's how you open it. And it's got bad visibility. You can't see the mechanism that opens the cupboard. In fact, you almost can't see the seams between the cupboards. This is low visibility. And you can kind of imagine somebody getting confused about how to open these things because they don't know where the parts are. They can't see them. They don't know they exist. Another classic example between these two computers when you're using, the computer on the left, the power button's right there in front of you. It's visible. The computer on the right, it's around behind where you can't see it, so it's got lower visibility. The phone on the left's got a very obvious hold button, so if you're trying to put somebody on hold, you're not going to get confused because you can't find a relevant button. You're going to be able to find that button. You might get confused for another reason. The one on the right's an older phone. You have to push R and then key an 18. There's no visibility for that feature. You can easily imagine somebody not knowing where the hold button is, essentially. Visible state, this caps lock button on the left has a little thing that goes on and off, and light. So that's got very clear visible state. Whereas the one on the right just pops right back up when you hit it. It does not have visible state. So let's go to video games. So this Tomb Raider example has wonderful visibility. You can see all the parts. You can see the lever. You can see the door. You can see the gears. You can see the post. It's all very clear and apparent to you. And then the state of them is equally apparent. If the lever's up or down. Those are the 2 states the lever has. If the door's open or closed. 2 states of the door. And then if you think about these posts, you can either, for the purpose of the puzzle, they're either solved because they have a gear on them, or they're not yet solved because they're still just posts. And again, all that stuff is very visually apparent. Who here has not played Portal? Anybody never played Portal? Oh, you guys are in deep trouble. So see you later. No, just kidding. I've been working on this presentation for years, and I was really excited when Portal came along. I've been working on the ideas of it, not literally. Okay, anyway. Because Portal really nicely and cleanly illustrates a ton of the points in this presentation. Fortunately, I'm mostly going to stick to the first room in Portal for the most part, and that's a pretty conventional video game situation. So it shouldn't be that confusing if you don't know anything about Portal. So here's the first room in Portal, and all the parts of this puzzle are very visible. You can see them. And as a matter of fact, the states of these objects is very visible. You know if that button is up or down. You know if the door is open or closed. And there's a couple different ways to see whether the door is open or closed. With respect to puzzles, I decompose every element having to do with the puzzle into one of 2 different things. It's either an object associated with the puzzle, or it's a step that the player has to go through to solve the puzzle. And so we've mostly talked about objects so far, but steps can have visibility as well. And I think that's what this sign in Portal is doing. It's like kind of making visible the otherwise intangible idea that you have to go through this door. It's making it more visible, which helps with the clarity of this puzzle. Portal does all kinds of great visibility things. Like the second room you're in, you have to use portals to teleport between these rooms that have objects in them and collect them. You have to get a crate and put it on a button. And they made the walls transparent so you could see the elements of the puzzle. They're always visible no matter where you are. And this wasn't technically necessary for the solution to the puzzle. Those walls could have been opaque. It's equally functional as a puzzle. It's just easier to see them because they're more visible. This pit is sort of part of the challenge. It's very visible. You can tell what you're trying to solve in this puzzle. That's not always the case in puzzles. We'll see some examples later. So there's a class of puzzles in Portal where there's these little orbs that sort of bounce around, and you have to use your portals to channel them from place to place. And there's sort of this intangible object in these puzzles, which is like the spot that the orb is going to hit the wall, because they come out of these ejectors, and they're always going to hit the wall in the same spot. And you kind of have to put a portal there sometimes. That's a step that you have to do to solve the puzzle. And so there's an important object, which is where it's going to hit the wall. And these scorch marks are cool because they're realistic, whatever. But they also have this other function of making this invisible thing visible. You can see where it's going to hit the wall, so you know where to put your portal. It's pretty cool. When you walk in this room in Portal, the crate falls into the pit, and that makes the crate visible. The fact that it has motion draws your attention to it. And if it didn't do this, you would have to go through a process of discovering that this crate was in a pit, right? And so it's more visible because it falls in when you walk in. And that's like a great example of how to increase visibility if you're having this problem, like giving motion to things, making particle effects go flying out of them, having them play a sound, having them be in light or emit light, having gameplay associated with them. Those are all great ways to increase the visibility of an element in your puzzle. Moving on to Thief Deadly Shadows, here's how we used visibility in that game. So starting on the top left, that switch is very visible. It's in a clear spot. It's bright. It's at eye level, etc. The one on the bottom left is less visible. It's in the dark, but it's still, it's at eye level and so forth. It's in an obvious spot in the level. The bottom right one is not very visible. It's actually kind of hidden, right? It's like inside a bookcase where switches don't normally go. It's not at eye level, etc. So this one is has low visibility. And the one on the top right is actually a torch that's secretly a switch, and we're going to come back to that in a second. But among other things, it is not in a very visible spot and level. It's not a very visible object. And so one of the points that this starts to get at is there's a difference between user interface design and puzzle design, which is in puzzle design, you're not actually trying to make everything completely obvious. You might actually take these principles and misuse them on purpose because you're trying to provide some challenge to the player. And we'll come back to that. Working on Dark Messiah, this is kind of like the contrast to that pit and Portal example. Sometimes it's hard for people to know what they're supposed to be doing, like what step they're supposed to be solving or whatever. There's a lot of puzzles in Dark Messiah where you're trying to get up to the top of something, like in this case. And, if you're standing in the right spot, you can see that door and the other piece of set dressing that suggests that this is a destination. But only if you're actually up high. And when you're down below, you can't see it. So earlier I said gameplay is a good way to add visibility. So one of the ways we solve this is put some monsters up there that are shooting at you. Makes it really hard to miss the fact that this higher shelf exists. So you at least know it's there. You add visibility. It's kind of like the equivalent of that sign in Portal. Here's another example from Dark Messiah. This is the one we're going to come back to the most about Dark Messiah. But, for the purposes of this example, there's a couple buildings in this area, and the player had to figure out what to do, right? And so you could go inside one of the buildings and look around, but that didn't mean you knew what to do. It turned out what you had to do is jump over to this other building and go down, and there was a tunnel inside it, and then that would lead to the next area. But this had very low visibility, and players just didn't know it existed. They did not know they were supposed to do this thing. And so there's a couple of different ways we can solve it. One is we can put an object in that spot between the buildings, and it just calls attention to the gap between buildings. And so you can actually see the step of the puzzle. Again, it's kind of equivalent to that sign in Portal. Not as good, but similar. And kind of an easier one is you put windows that you can't move through at the bottom so you can look inside and see the pit. Again, that's adding visibility. Next principle is affordances. We use this term a lot in video game design. So I'm going to talk about it mostly with respect to puzzles. So the best way to explain these is with examples. What is the affordance of this thing? Is to climb. It affords climbing. What is the affordance of this thing? It's washing windows. This thing affords washing windows. It's what you can do with it, what it appears that you can do with it. And even if you had no example, no prior experience with a ladder, it still has some things that afford climbing. It has rungs that you can put your hands on that kind of afford gripping or afford stepping on, and the verticality of it kind of affords some sort of up-down thing. And so you can imagine coming to an understanding of what this thing does, even though you've never seen it before. Another class, these things afford pulling, whereas this thing affords pushing. The one on the right is interesting because like it has like no mechanical necessity. Like unlike the other ones, it doesn't do anything mechanically to help the door open. It's just user interface. It's just there to show you where to push the door and the fact that you should push the door. Virtual buttons, we're very familiar with them. We almost kind of forget that they're buttons. But what they are is, a software construction that affords pushing because that's how you're supposed to interface with the software. This thing in the new version of Office is a button, but God knows that no one knows that until someone else tells you, and that's kind of a problem. It affords like a logo. We hate Microsoft. Okay. Back to video games. This is a door in Portal, and so therefore it affords these things that are important to the puzzle. It affords opening, it affords closing, it affords moving through. These are the things it does. It doesn't actually look much like a door, right? So it's not necessarily a home run on the affordance. It kind of looks like something else potentially. This thing, they call it a cube, and it affords a bunch of stuff. You can pick it up, you can drop it, you can carry it around, you can stand on it, you can drop it on top of other things. But can you open it? No, you can't open it. But it kind of looks like a crate. In lots of games, you can open things like boxes and crates. So one of the important points is affordances are actually in the mind of the player. Like they're not what we think they are. This thing does afford opening in the sense of user interface design. In video games, we usually don't say that. We usually talk about affordances as what actually is possible. In user interface design and user-centered design, affordances is in the mind of the user. So it's like this thing does afford opening because if the player thinks like, oh yeah, I can probably open that, then it's suggesting that you can do that. And so, you have to be careful with your affordances. You have to tune them because sometimes the player is thinking they can do something they can't. You could imagine a player getting stuck in Portal because they're trying to open this crate or whatever. This thing, they call it a button in Portal, but it affords a lot more like a pressure plate. You can stand on it. You can put stuff on it. It can go up and down. There's a little, graphic on the side of it that suggests some of those affordances. They call it a button. It's really a pressure plate, and it affords more like a pressure plate, so that's handy. One of the points I want to make here is that this room doesn't have great affordances. I mean, it does, but they're not super apparent. One of the things you do when you're playing a game and you come across a puzzle is you start to deduce the affordances. Like you come across something and you're not sure what it is, and you kind of have to figure out what it's for. And so this thing's weird, but it's got this cool platform, and so you start to think like it affords standing on. And then later when you activate it and it starts moving, because you can stand on something moving, that means it affords riding on. And specifically, it goes back between these 2 points, so it kind of affords riding from point A to B. And that becomes an important thing that you understand about this puzzle and use it to solve it, and we'll come back to that later. In Dark Messiah, yeah, there's this puzzle where there's this, it's pretty cool. There's a big dragon. He's like, he's in this doorway or whatever. The way you solve this puzzle is by closing the door on its neck. Players tried all kinds of other stuff, like fighting it with their weapons and spells for some weird reason, or running away and try to find a way around it, or trying to run past it. None of that stuff worked. The only thing you could do is chop off its head. And a way to make this puzzle easier was to make sure that gate door thing really afforded head severance, which is what it's for, right? Like you want to put spikes on the end, you want them to glint, you want it to like wobble back and forth dangerously. You increase that affordance, and that helps the player understand what they're supposed to do. This example here, that plank drew attention to make that gap more visible. It also afforded crossing it. It afforded this idea that you could get from building A to building B. Even if the plank collapsed or something like that, you've at least put it in the mind of the player. So visibility and affordance go together really well. First you draw the player's attention to something, then you provide a suggestion about what they should do. Here's this example in Dark Messiah again. Pardon me for the low-res screenshot. It was this really awesome area. It was like a combat arena and some story things happened. It was a cool reused space, good for game design. Had some other problems with affordances though. So first, you're in this big area and you do some stuff, and then you can kind of tell you're supposed to get close to the building. And at this point, you're like, oh, it must be I'm supposed to go in this building. So you try to open the door, but that doesn't work. And at this point, you realize you're stuck and you're probably solving a puzzle, you hope. And so you start trying some stuff. There's some runes around, so maybe you're supposed to cast spells at these runes, or maybe you're supposed to climb up, parts of the architecture. Maybe you can break this thing. It looks like maybe you can break it. None of these things work, and this is not going well. Taking a few steps back, maybe you're supposed to shoot. Now the player's exhaustively exploring affordances. This environment is, as I said, with red herrings, it's got affordance clutter. It's full of things that you might be able to do to solve the problem. Can you shoot this thing? Can you push or turn this statue? Maybe you can knock this thing over and walk across it like a bridge. Maybe if I go in here, something will happen. And so this isn't great. It turned out the real affordance was to climb down, as I said, and that's bad, right? Because you're telling the player to climb down to get up, and that's not an affordance that occurs to the player easily. And so from a purely affordance point of view, the right way to fix this problem would be to make one of the more obvious affordances actually be the one that worked. Maybe you should knock something down that makes a bridge so you can get up. There's other solutions. Okay, visual language. So we've talked about a lot of stuff about cluttered environments, and this one is like, there's stuff in the environment that's just not interactive at all, and other stuff that is. And visual language is a great way to signal to the player what's going to be interactive and what's not. So Mirror's Edge does a wonderful job of this. The things that are climbable are red, and things that are not climbable are not red. Very stylish, very clear. Visual language. In Portal, they use this construction to indicate a surface that you should use for momentum jumping. A lot of times it's not even a physical necessity for solving the problem. It's really just there to signal to you that this is a step you might want to do right now to solve a puzzle. They do a good job with surfaces that are either portable or not. This is a visual language. It's a little rough and ready. It's not like exacting. But most of the time you can kind of look at a surface and get a really obvious idea about whether you're going to be able to make a portal in that surface or not. I love this example from Tomb Raider Legend. They introduced this kind of pole climbing thing where Lara can climb up and down tall, vertical, skinny objects. The problem is that their world is full of tall, skinny, vertical objects of different sizes and shapes and colors and flavors. And, so how does the player know in advance just by looking at one whether they can climb it or not? Well, there's ones that were clearly thin enough and that were going to qualify, and then you had a few others that were like way too thick, and definitely you couldn't do those. And then the problem is like all these ones in the middle where it's hard to tell and there's an interpretation. So one way to solve this visual language is to get rid of these. And if you have a world where everything's either clearly thin enough or clearly too thick, that's good visual language. Like with a quick glance, the player knows what's interactive and what's not. And it also affords the artists enough range to like play with the visual style. It's not saying that they have to be red or green or whatever. We had very cluttered environments in Thief, so I'm going to take a look at sort of what some of the ways we use visual language. Remember this puzzle? It's like, hey, go read the books in the library. So there's a lot of books in the library. It turns out we didn't make them all readable, right? So how's the player supposed to know which ones are readable, which aren't? Well, the example here kind of shows it well. Like we had a rule that every time there's a readable book, it had to be open, kind of at chest level, and usually we tried to place it near something interesting like that window. All the ones that are on shelves and closed were never readable. We never violated this rule, to my knowledge. And yeah, it made it really obvious which books you could read, and players didn't like go through exhaustive hunts. Here's one that's like a little bit more vague, but still kind of worked. Like this is kind of a cluttered environment, but you can kind of pick out the most interesting potentially gameplay relevant object in it. And there's lighting and so forth, but there's also this like concentric ring of like pillars or columns or whatever around it. And again, here like the most sort of interesting and important gameplay thing has these concentric circles around it. And ditto here. So the idea isn't that like, you instantly know to go search at the concentric circles. The idea is that like if you get stuck, it's very unlikely that you're not going to check that thing out because you kind of get a sense that it's important. And it kind of is a little bit on the subliminal side for us as well as the players, I think. Here's an example where we didn't follow that and it's a bad cluttered environment. So that thing on the bottom right is a trap door. But you can totally imagine players like not realizing that or thinking they have to do something with the vent or the valve or whatever. And if you had taken that trapdoor and sort of put it in the center with a couple concentric things around it, very unlikely that players would completely overlook it. Okay, next principle is feedback. Let me see what I'm doing for time. Time bad. Okay. Feedback. So feedback tells when something changes or something happens, it tells the player what's been done or not, what's been accomplished or not. You get to see the object do its thing, and if, whether or not you've taken some steps. So this is feedback for the tea kettle. This is feedback that you have accomplished creating toast out of bread when it pops back up. This is feedback that you're trying to push the U button, but you actually hit the I button, but it doesn't matter because the iPhone is going to correct what you typed in anyway to something you didn't intend to say. The feedback for virtual buttons is really important. They're not really buttons, so we need to build in feedback that makes them feel like they're real objects functioning. This is pretty true of most puzzles. Like you kind of need to build in the sense of physicality because it doesn't really exist. This puzzle in Portal has wonderful feedback. It's really juicy. All kinds of things happen when you step on that plate. Like it depresses and it lights up and everything makes sound and things change colors and doors open. It's like, God, you couldn't have more feedback. And like if you get confused and you start walking towards that door because you think you solved the puzzle, it all undoes itself. It all flips back. And so it's really clear that something has changed back to some other way. Really good feedback. And the steps can have feedback as well, not just the objects. So every time you solve a puzzle in Portal, the evil AI who runs the place gives you like the same kind of tone of feedback, like, hey, good job, you did something right. There's these buttons in Portal that when you push them, they start making ticking sounds and like a door opens. It's a pretty common way they're used. Feedback is like the game talking to the player. It's just sounds, but at the same time, it's really the game saying words to the player. It's saying like, tick, tick, tick means like, you're running out of time. This is a timed puzzle. You better get moving. That's what the game's saying. And when the door opens, it's like, by the way, this might be something you want to do with your time. Portal has a wonderful piece of feedback when you try to portal into a non-portable surface. There's like a special couple of particle effects and a cool sound. It's very distinct. It's telling you like, no, you can't make a portal here. And so players talk to the game, and the game talks back. When a player shoots the surface, they're saying like, oh, I've got this puzzle figured out. I know what I'm going to do. First thing I'm going to do is put a portal here, and then Portal says back to the player, no, you can't put a portal here. And the player's like, well, shit, there must be something else then, right? This is dialogue. This is a very important point. When feedback works well, the game and the player are talking to each other. The player is asking, like, is this the solution to the puzzle? And when you do it right, the feedback answers the player and either says, yeah, you're on the right track, or no, you're not on the right track. So this Tomb Raider puzzle has a wonderful example of feedback where, like, as you're making progress on the puzzle, as you mount these gears and you pull the lever, you see them turning. Clearly, you're doing something right. You're making progress. Something's happening, but you're not quite there yet. In Thief, there is this, we talked about this switch that was hard to see. And in terms of affordance, it also does not afford like a switch. It affords like a torch. It's like a secret switch. But we gave it tons of feedback, like it turned very clearly and it made a sound and there's like an off-screen rumble kind of sound. It's like, don't worry, it's really weird, but something right happened. It helps the player stay on the right track. You're doing something right. So come back to this example of affordance clutter in Dark Messiah. Another way to solve this problem is to make sure the feedback is good. Like here's a great example. If the game, as the player tries these different things and as they're basically asking questions, do I have to push this statue? Do I have to shoot that weird thing? The game answers with feedback like, no, that's not it. No, that's not it. And that helps the player know, like, okay, stop exploring that way. That's not the solution. Try something else. And the worst thing you can do is not say anything. But this is really common in puzzle design where the game just does not reply. You go to open that door. Here's an example. Like if you go to open that door and it goes like rattle, rattle, and it's like the systemic solution for every time you try to open a door you can't open yet, you're like, oh, I can't open this door yet. And the game has told you, no, that's not the right track. If you go to open the door and it doesn't give you any more feedback than a texture does, like there's no affordance at all, nothing happens, no feedback, then you're not sure. You're confused. The game has not told you you're not on the right track. Moving on to mapping. Mapping is physically connecting objects or conceptually connecting them if they're not physically connected. So this is the classic user-centered design example of mapping. The top two have bad mapping because there's some confusion on the stoves about which dial controls which burner. Some of it's non-ambiguous, but some of it is. The bottom one has no ambiguity. It's mapped well. Like you just know which dial is going to connect to which burner. This is a great example of mapping. Not only do you know what this controller on the bottom right is likely to control, because it's shaped like a chair, it controls a chair, also like the controls correspond. So when you move a part of the button or the controller, you're also moving that same corresponding part of the chair. That's good mapping. Hey, this is a puzzle about teaching babies about mapping in a way. Back to video games. Portal, this first-person Portal has wonderful mapping. It's right there. It's physical connection practically. In Thief, sometimes we did this well. Like the example on the right, we actually physically mapped our buttons to the things they control. That really helps with clarity about what those buttons do. That thing on the left does not afford like an elevator, but it happens to be an elevator. And those two buttons are pretty well mapped. One of them, makes the elevator go up, the other makes it go down, conceptually mapped. Sometimes we do not do this so well. So you can clearly see this switch on the left. It's a switch, but you have no idea what it does. Again, for that example of the hidden torch switch, it was deliberately not mapped. We wanted players to figure out this thing was a switch. Conceptual mapping is cool. You might find these two things in Portal and have no idea what they are or what they do, but you can get a sense that they go together because they have a very similar visual design. The best way that we tried to solve this puzzle in Dark Messiah is with mapping. Instead of having all the buildings look kind of the same, we thought maybe if you textured them to look different, it would put this idea in the player's head that this building looks the same as that one up there. So if I want to get up there, maybe it has something to do with this building. It kind of helped them get on the right track. And the last principle is conceptual models, which is understanding how the systems that you're interacting with in the puzzle work under the hood, how they really work. So the best example from user-centered design to describe this is an oven. If you want to get an oven to the temperature of 300 degrees, does setting it to 500 get it to the temperature of 300 faster than just setting it to 300? So the answer to this depends on what conceptual model is accurate. So if you believe, or if the way the oven works is that the higher you turn up the temperature, the bigger the flame you get inside the oven, then yes, turning up to 500 does get it to 300 faster. But if the way it works is that there's just a thermostat that either turns the flame on at full blast or doesn't turn it on at all, then it doesn't matter if it's 300 or 500. It takes an equal amount of time. This is what conceptual models is. It's sort of how does this thing work, and it helps the user understand if they have the right conceptual model, how to interact with the device to get what they're hoping for. Radio buttons do this, right? Checkboxes kind of have the conceptual model that you've got a pencil and you can check off as many things as you want. But the idea behind radio buttons is, that only one of them can be depressed at a time, and they're actually drawing from this conceptual model of old school car radio. Has anyone ever seen one of these? I'm just gauging how old I am. Okay. All right. So this is a physical thing where you push the button, and the button that was previously depressed comes back up through a physical process, and the software is just emulating that idea of radio buttons, even though it's not mechanically modeled that way. And ditto in Tomb Raider, it's kind of like the thing you're solving in this puzzle is, the conceptual model, like this idea that there's a mechanism that if the right gear turns is going to open the door, and you kind of have to figure out how to make that gear turn. It's a conceptual, and then probably there's not a whole lot of gear physics modeling going on in Tomb Raider 1. But nevertheless, they programmed it to operate that way so it would match your conceptual model. Ditto, this is a really simple puzzle in Portal, but it's a conceptual model puzzle. The thing you have to understand is that any weight will hold down that button and keep the door open. That's the conceptual model you have to get into your head in order to solve this puzzle in Portal. And you can imagine players having completely valid alternate conceptual models that don't work. Maybe this thing is a heat detector and it only detects hot things. That's why it opens when I stand on it. So I have to build a fire on it or something like that. There's a conceptual model about those orbs, which is that if you can get an orb into one of these receptacles, it energizes the system, and you can use that to open doors. And then there's a conceptual model about the robots. Anything that knocks the robot over will kill it, because even though Aperture is apparently a multi-gazillion dollar corporation, they can't design robots that work when they're sitting down. And they didn't think to bolt them to the floor either. But that's pretty cool, because once you realize that this is how the robots work, any solution you can think of that knocks the robots over will work. So now we're moving on to part 2. Oh, I'm doing really good for time. That happens to me. Okay, so this is the idea of puzzle structures. Everything we just talked about is some good user interface principles to keep in mind when designing a puzzle. But then the question is how do we know when and how to apply those principles? And so puzzle structures help to answer that question. They help you dial your solutions in. And it's based loosely on, again, Norman's 7 stages of action, which in his mind were this ability to predict the way any user would approach a novel situation. And if this was true, that'd be great, right? If you could predict the future and there's only 1 of 3 things that a user would do every time they picked up your cell phone or your tea kettle or whatever, then you could really focus your design effort on making those steps super clear and guiding the user into your experience. And to a degree, it's true, but it's not magical either. And he didn't describe it in a very formal way. So again, I sort of adapted his work and came up with something that's fairly different, which is called puzzle structures. And they're a lot more like design documents. Instead of trying to predict the future, what you're doing is you're describing what you have created in your puzzle in the world. You're basically writing down the solution that you know to be true because you're the designer. But it turns out to be handy in terms of figuring out where to apply your effort. So let's go to that first puzzle in Portal and construct the puzzle structure for it. The first thing the player needs to understand in this puzzle is that their goal is to get through the open door. It could potentially be lots of things you're supposed to do in this room. The player needs to understand that they're trying to get through that door. Then the player has to understand that what they're trying to do is not just open the door, but open the door in a way that makes it stay open. It's easy to open the door, but it takes a little bit extra work to keep it open. And to do that with the player, I'm kind of working backwards here. The player has to know that what you're supposed to do is put the cube on the button. You got to pick that cube up, carry it over, and drop it on the button. And so this is the right track. This is the thing that you've constructed for the player. This is the puzzle that you've set out for them. And you're asking the player to construct this thing in their minds as well. And if they can't do it, they can't solve the puzzle, right? And it looks pretty simple. There's only 3 steps here. So that's cool. But what's in a step? There's actually kind of a lot, right? So for just the put the cube on the button step, you need to know a lot of things. You need to know that cube exists. It's in the level. You got to know you can pick it up, carry it around, drop it. You got to know that it can be dropped on the button specifically. And you got to understand that it has weight, because that's part of the conceptual model. And ditto on the button, you got to know the thing exists and it has this affordance where it goes up and down, and that it can be depressed by any weight, yours or the crates. That's a lot of stuff, and that's where the principles come in handy, right? The entire point of user-centered design is that the objects and situations themselves can convey this type of information and put it in your user's mind, and so therefore they have the information they need to solve your puzzle, one step at a time. So let's imagine it's back in the primordial times of Portal design, and they're working on this first puzzle, and it's going really badly, and they're getting this playtest feedback because they haven't designed it quite as well as they ultimately did when they shipped it yet, right? So, and they're getting some examples of the player going off the right track. The player's not on that right track we just described. So maybe, the player never seems to notice the cube. Maybe the cube's in a different room or in a dark corner or whatever, and the player's just focused on this button. They're trying to maybe they're jumping up and down on it to jam it down. Who knows? but they're not interacting with the cube. Well, they're stuck on this step. They don't know that you're supposed to get this cube and put it on the button, and it's because they don't know the cube exists, presumably, and that's a visibility problem, right? So this potential solution is to increase the visibility of the cube, throw some particle effects on it, put it in the light, make the room smaller so you don't have to wander off to find it, that kind of a thing. Kind of obvious. Suppose the player pushes the button, but they're facing the wrong way, or the door that opens is another room, or whatever. Basically, they don't notice that anything changes when they push that button, and so they give up. They're like, oh, that has nothing to do with the puzzle, right? So the step they're stuck on is that they're supposed to open the door and keep it open. They don't know about opening the door, and that's because there's this quality of the button that they haven't realized that the button opens the door, and so this is a feedback problem, or you could solve it with mapping as well. So the potential solutions are you put in all that nice feedback that we saw, that Portal actually shipped with, to make it super clear that this button opens that door, or you can add the mapping, which and additionally clarifies what the button does. Right, never mind. Okay, so let's say the early version of the Portal button was textured to look like a bullseye, and so players get out their guns and shoot it alive. Suppose they have guns in Portal. So they think that it's something you shoot, So what's the problem here? Well, they're supposed to be putting the cube on the button, and that's not what they're doing with the button. They don't know it's a button that can be depressed. This is an affordance problem. They think the button affords shooting at, when it really doesn't. And so there's a couple possible solutions. One is you can decrease the shoot affordance of the button. You see this in real puzzles all the time, where players think that the thing does something else and spend a lot of time trying to do that thing to it. Right? We're trying to shoot a button because it looks like a bullseye, so don't make it so it doesn't look like a bullseye. Maybe you didn't intend that affordance to be present when you ship this object, but now you realize it has it. Take it out. And then, of course, you can increase the depressed affordance of the button. And Portal did a lot of that. It's got all kinds of buttoniness that it has. So you can kind of look at it and know it's a button. Here's a very slight variation on this example. Suppose that what the player is doing is standing next to the door that's going to open and shooting the button in hopes that the button's going to cause the door to open, and they're going to jump through in that split second the door is open. This is very slightly different because, sure, the player's not on the right track, and so you can do all that stuff we just said to help them be on the right track. Anytime the player is doing anything other than being on the right track, pointing them back to the right track is always helpful. But it's also the case, so you can do this stuff. It's also the case that the player is on the wrong track. They've got some other wrong track in their mind where they think you can open this door by shooting the button. Specifically, this is the wrong track they've constructed. They did not construct the right track you're hoping. Instead, they're doing this. They think that they should stand near the door and then shoot the button, which will cause the door to open, and then they're going to move through the open door. So this necessarily doesn't work, because if it did work, it wouldn't be the wrong track. It'd be an alternate right track. It'd be some other right track that you maybe didn't intend, but it's a way to solve the puzzle. So since it's not the right track, something's broken here. And specifically in this case, what's broken is the fact that shooting the button does not open the door. And so this is where we need to apply that negative feedback we talked about. This is where the game needs to tell the player somehow, as clearly as possible, no, that's not right. The player has asked, can I shoot this button to open the door? And the game needs to say back to them, no, you cannot. So if it's not working, if this is a big problem you have in playtest, you could increase the clarity of that negative feedback. You could have the bullets deflect off. There's a special interaction that happens for all these buttons to make it 100% clear that the gun doesn't do that. Another plausible wrong track, maybe you think that what you're supposed to do is stand on the button, and when the door opens, you sprint towards it, and then you dash through at the last second. And again, it has to be broken somewhere, and in this case, this is how Portal shipped. It's broken here. As you sprint towards that door, it closes, and that's pretty clear feedback that you are on the wrong track. A couple other cool things about puzzle structures. We talked about this thing that has this affordance that you can deduce by observing it and stuff, that you can use this thing to ride from point A to point B. I remember getting this puzzle and not being sure what was going on in the puzzle, but when I saw that, I realized that this is a step of the puzzle. The game had fed me one of the steps, and from there I can start to derive the other steps. Well, it must be I'm supposed to get to point A, and when I get to point B, what should I do? And so the game is giving you a step, and then you can kind of use it as a constraint to figure out what the puzzle is to construct the right path. This first puzzle in Portal is kind of a puzzle, and another way it's just kind of training about how these crates and buttons work and doors work, because later on they're going to reuse that, a lot. So when you get to this room and you see that crate go down there, you know that what you're supposed to do is go get that crate and put it on a door, and then on a button, and then a door will open, and that's the end of the puzzle. And so you start thinking to yourself, well, I got to go get that cube, or because it's Portal, you might think stuff like, I got to get that cube to come up here of its own accord, or a variety of ways you can solve that. So this is the idea of reusing the familiar steps. You have little chunks of a puzzle that you can reuse in multiple places because the players are familiar with them now. So, one of the things about these puzzle structures is there's no science to knowing exactly how to break it down. Putting the cube on the button could break down this other way. As I just mentioned, in Portal, it can break down a lot of other ways. You can use portals to move cubes around. You don't have to pick them up yourself. You should break them down into the most granularity that's necessary to clarify the puzzle. And if you don't get any more data from the low granularity you have, then it's too granular. It's just an art. So now I'm going to talk about like a more legitimate example. How much time do I have? I have 5 minutes. We can do it, I hope. Okay, so this is going to be quick. This is where I got the most stuck in Portal. It's like pretty close to the end of the game, and I knew from experience that I had to like jump up into this shaft and proceed from the right side of the screen to the left. It turned out the way you did it is there's this, you backtrack a little bit, and there's a room with a rocket turret in it, and what you had to do is like create a portal in that room, and then run back to where you were, and then you make a portal on the floor, and so then over here the rocket sees you through the portal, and he shoots a rocket, and the rocket misses you because you dodge out of the way, and then goes up and explodes and hits this tube in the ceiling, and this crate comes out of the tube, and then you can use that crate, and you can climb up there. So this is a complicated puzzle in Portal. This is what the puzzle diagram looks like, or one possible puzzle diagram looks like. To zoom in, you got to get to the next area. That's your goal. To do that, you have to get to the inside of that shaft, and to get into the inside of the shaft, you have to jump and stand on a cube. But first, you have to get a cube, and the way you get it is you have to get it out of that tube. So down on the bottom side of the diagram, to get the cube to come out of the tube, you have to blast a hole in it. In order to blast a hole in it, you have to get that turret to shoot at you, but hit the tube. And specifically how you do that is you make a portal connection between the line of sight of the turret and the line of sight of the tube, i.e. you make it the case that the turret can see the cube, and then you get it to shoot at you. And so to do that last step, you can put ands and ors in puzzle structures. You have to set up these two portals, one near the cube, one on the floor, right? So that's the whole structure. Why was this hard for me? Why did I not find this right track? The biggest reason is because I didn't know you could blast open tubes. Like, I didn't know they had that affordance. I've never done it before. I never had to do it. I'd seen these tubes a lot, and I never interacted with them that way. And another is because they'd been using these pneumatic tubes where the crates go through them as like set dressing for a while, and I had stopped looking at them. They had low visibility for me. I did not pay attention to them anymore. So here are all the wrong tracks I tried. I'm going to run through them real quick. The first thing I tried to do is dodge the entire puzzle by shooting a portal past the puzzle. And then, you shoot one near you where it's easy to get to, and then one way past it. And that didn't work. The dotted line means that step was broken. Like, there was no way I could shoot a portal past it. That did not work. And then there's pretty clear feedback because Portal has good systemic feedback for that kind of thing, as I said. The next way is I tried to crouch jump in, and that never works in Half-Life anyway, so nothing about Portal. And there's really shitty feedback. So I tried that a lot, and I eventually decided that the reason it wasn't working is because it wasn't possible, not just because I had no idea how to use it. Wrong track number 3 was I tried to shoot a portal up on the wall above the shaft, and then one on like the ground or floor or whatever, and then like try to jump through and get inside the shaft that way. And the reason it didn't work is because I couldn't find a spot high enough. There's no portable surface high enough to make that jump. Or, you could say that I could make a surface, but I couldn't complete the jump. Like the jump was the part that was broken. Either way, something was broken, and that solution didn't work either. And this is my attempt to rocket jump into... So what I did is I got, if you can get the turret to shoot rockets at the tube, you can also get him to shoot at you. And so I get him to shoot at me, and then I would jump, and it would explode under my feet. And this is broken because there's no such thing as rocket jumping in Portal. And so when an explosion happens under your feet, that's not what happens. So what's up with puzzle structures? Why do we care about them? Well, because you've got all this information you're trying to put in the player's head, and you're trying to get this structure in their head that they're supposed to solve. And instead of doing it by trial and error on an ad hoc basis, you can kind of catalog it and lay it out in front of you and see it in a pretty systemic way, in a formal way, and you can kind of verify that you're applying those principles we talked about in the right places where it's going to be important. And then when playtest data comes up, you can check to see what's going wrong with your puzzle, and if the player is not finding the right path, if they're off the right path, you can increase the use of the principles in the appropriate spots. And if they're on some wrong path, you can improve your negative feedback to communicate to them, no, don't do that. So does this mean what you're supposed to do is make this giant chart where every single piece of your puzzle is across the top and every single principle is across the side and you fill everything out and make sure it's... No, you're not supposed to do that. Puzzle structures are design documents, and you should treat them like any other design document. They're really good for helping you think through the entire thing, especially if it's a hard one and you don't feel like your instincts are up for the task. You kind of want to lay it out and see it in front of you. It's a lot of work to do this, though, so if it's an easy one, you feel like you got it in hand, maybe not so much, you need to document it. And, of course, you'll never be completely right in advance. You're always going to need to go into playtest and adjust. So it really depends on how much you feel like you need to think it through and formalize it for yourself, and how much you need to communicate externally. Like if I was handing off levels for some other team to build, I would probably want to build them so the team knows what we're trying to communicate to the player and how to keep them on the right track. And lastly, like this isn't even puzzle design. If you did this, this is UI design. This is like the ideal UI design where everything makes perfect sense and works. And as I said, in a good puzzle design, you're specifically trying to do a few things wrong to leave to the player to figure out. You know, the affordances are weird in that first room in Portal, and you were asking the player to figure out the conceptual model. You know, here's that button in Thief that has bad visibility. We're asking the player to find it. Here's that weird object in Portal, and we're asking the player to figure out what it does. And here's this conceptual model about activating receptacles with orbs, and that's what we're asking the player to deduce. And this is the part that makes the player feel smart. And like everything else is there to help the player feel smart. It's all the other pieces of user interface to guide them to coming to those understandings. So to come back to this question, how much guidance do you provide? How much do you pack into the player's backpack and lunchbox before you send them off into the puzzle? I kind of think that's the wrong way to think about it. And the nice thing about user-centered design and why we use it is because it provides guidance on demand. You know, as the player interacts with the puzzle, it provides more and more data, and so therefore it scales to the player's need. A really, perceptive, smart player who walks into a room and just gets a puzzle goes to solve it, and they don't get any more information than they need. And one who missed something or misinterprets or their oven mittens didn't work or whatever, who's having a problem, interacts with the puzzle more and more, and slowly the puzzle provides more and more data until they have enough to solve it, we hope. And so that helps them, it kind of helps them feel smart. They got as much information as they wanted. It's guidance on demand. And even if none of that was true, at least they're having a lot of activity. Like they're doing things with the puzzle. They're not like reading the manual and then going off and trying to solve it. Activity makes them feel involved. And that's it.